Howdy. This is Days of Noah number 43, and the title of this lecture is The Birth of the Beast System. And I find that when I use phraseology like this, a lot of people kind of shake their head, and even a lot of Christians will roll their eyes because I think that it doesn't really seem real that could happen. We've been in our entire lives, some of us have never really endured events like what are prophesied to come, and so many of us are in denial. That's just the reality of it, is that we are in denial of where we are at along the prophetic timeline of the Bible. And finally, we're coming to a place where things are starting to ramp up, and nobody can definitively say how much time we have. It could all go down in the next year or two, or it could be more like 5 or 10 years, or even 20 years. One thing I've learned about the New World Order is they're very patient. On the last couple lectures, I was reading quotes from men in the 1950s who were talking about the New World Order, and if they could just get the right conditions on planet Earth, the world would be ready to accept it. And it's through my research that I realized that this has been a very insidious plan based on incrementalism, that they were going to incrementally do it. And then eventually there was going to come a tipping point, though, the old proverbial, the final straw that breaks the camel's back, and then the system was going to move at light speed. But that couldn't take place until the infrastructure and the foundation had been completely solidified. And I would say today, with the technological revolutions of, the internet and satellite and 5G technology and on and on and on, really we're finally there. And now the New World Order are looking for opportunities to roll out the new system. And that's what we're going to try and take a look at today. I still have a lot of friends and colleagues who reject these concepts, and a lot of them, I believe, suffer from cognitive dissonance. We've discussed that term in the past. It's a real term. It's a real condition. The military coined that term. And it basically means that the way the human mind and the human body is made is that anything that is significantly outside of your worldview causes the body to become defensive and uncomfortable. And there's a knee-jerk reaction to reject whatever new information is coming in, irregardless of how much factual proof is being shown to demonstrate it. And so the enemy knows this too, and they capitalize on cognitive dissonance. And this is one of the reasons that they do all of the predictive programming and the subliminal programming throughout time, so that incrementally you really can't discern the times that you're in. This is one of the reasons why I come at it with so much information. One of the biggest complaints from my friends is that the videos are too long, there's too much information. Well, as the old saying goes, I don't want to show up to a gunfight with a knife. As it stands, people like myself are already branded as conspiracy theorists. That kind of terminology begins to decrease people's credibility. And so I've always believed that if you produced a tremendous amount of history, a tremendous amount of research and evidence, and then you backed it up with all of the symbolism, that is beyond the burden of proof. And so a lot of today is going to involve a lot of the symbolism as well, because as I've said in the past, the New World Order, they can use a lot of fancy words and flowery language to confuse us, but their symbols never lie. And so on that note, we will get started. I want to do a bit of a review, but also try to sort of consolidate some different ideas. In the last lecture, we've revealed that the origins of the very first currency on the planet comes from the seed of the serpent. That's very important. And that seed of the serpent was Cain and his lineage, the Kenites. You also have to keep in mind where they received this knowledge. They didn't just come up with it on their own. The fallen angels are the ones who disseminated it to them. So you have to ask yourself, why would they do that? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. The fallen angels are highly intelligent. They understand the pitfalls of humanity, and they knew that we could become enslaved by money. And so they're the ones who instituted this concept. And it worked, because very quickly mankind began to pursue precious metals and to build up the currencies, because essentially he who owns the most metals and currency is the one who's in control of the entire system. So it's all about power and control. Now there's this really strong relationship between the book of Genesis and the book of Revelations. It's kind of like what comes around goes around. Where you start is where you finish. It almost makes a circle, if you will. And in essence, Genesis opens God's story, and Revelation closes it. Some people describe Genesis and Revelations as two bookends of God's story, with all of the information and meat in between them. And so I think that the great Pastor Lawson kind of revealed this the best when he said, Genesis 1 talks about the creation of the heaven and the earth, and Revelation 21 talks about the creation of the new heaven and the new earth. Genesis 1 talks about the first Adam on earth, and Revelation 21 talks about the last Adam reigning in glory. Genesis 1 talks about the nights and the days and the seas that were created. But in Revelation 21, there is no more night, and eventually there is no more sun and no more seas. In Genesis 2, a bride is brought to Adam. But in Revelation 19, the bride is prepared for Jesus Christ. In Genesis 2, we see a tree of life to be found in the Garden of Eden. And in Revelation 22, a tree of life is found in the new creation. In Genesis 3, death and curse has been brought down upon mankind. But in Revelation 22, there is no more death and there is no more curse, for God will wipe away every tear from your eye. In Genesis 3, we see there's going to be the great conflict between Christ and Satan. And in Revelation 20, the conflict ends, and that Satan's final doom is sealed when he's cast into the lake of fire. In Genesis 3, man is driven from God's face because of his fallen condition. But in Revelation 21, men will see the face of the Almighty God. In Genesis 22, they ask, where is the lamb that is to be offered as a sacrifice? But in Revelation 22, we see the lamb is the Lord Jesus Christ, and he reigns forever. In Genesis 3, Satan utters the first lie on this planet. And in Revelation 21, no lie will enter the kingdom of heaven. Thus we have the beginning and the end, as the Word of God encompasses all time, the past, the present, and the future. I thought that was very well said by Pastor Lawson, and the reason I included that is the Holy Spirit has brought this understanding to me, that another thing that we can add to this concept of Genesis and Revelations is this. In Genesis, the seed of the serpent instituted the first currency to snare mankind, and in Revelations, the seed of the serpent will institute the last currency to snare mankind, and that is the mark of the beast system. This is Satan's counterfeit version of the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. In the Bible, Jesus Christ is the Alpha, the Omega, the first and the last. Well, in Satan's world, he counterfeits everything that God has, and so we see on the dollar bill George Washington, the first president, with an Omega symbol over his head, which means the last currency. And for years I've been saying that the Alpha and the Omega symbolism here is the first president, George Washington, and the last currency on the earth, the dollar. But just this week I've been given a deeper understanding that it's actually The people who designed this dollar are the same seed line who designed the first currency on planet Earth. And so really what this symbol means is the first and the last is the first and last currency. That the God of this world is the one who created the first currency, and the God of this world is the one who's creating the last currency. And this, my friends, is the last currency before the mark of the beast. And I'm going to do everything within my power to prove that going forward. So in past lectures, we revealed that Cain was the author of measures and weights. And it was through his posterity that currencies and precious metals were introduced to the world. This would quickly lead to what we referred to as the Babylonian system, where those who could acquire the most money would have all the power and control over the rest of us. As the famous Jewish historian Josephus stated, Cain augmented his household through much wealth by raping and violence. See, that's how Cain got rich. He excited his acquaintance to procure pleasures and spoils of robbery, and he became a great leader of men into wicked courses. And this next part is very important. He also introduced a change in that way of simplicity wherein men lived before. And he changed the world into cunning craftiness. See, prior to Cain, none of this stuff existed. He introduced this change. And whereas they lived innocently and generously before this time, while they knew nothing of these ways or these arts, Cain changed the world into cunning craftiness. He first of all set boundaries about lands. He built a city. He fortified it with walls. He was the first true craftsman or mason. And he called it Enoch. Now Tubal-Cain, who was 7 generations later, exceeded all men in strength. We see that as the generations go on, they're becoming more powerful, they're becoming more knowledgeable, their genetics are being concentrated. And he was very expert and famous for martial performances. That means the art of war, martial arts, fighting. He procured what tended to the pleasures of the body by that method, by martial performances. And first of all, he invented the art of making brass. We know from previous lectures that he was the great artificer and architect of all metallurgy. And because that he knew that he was to be punished for Cain's murder of his brother, I think that's an extremely important point. Even Tubal-Cain, 7 generations later, knew that he was going to continue to be punished for Cain's murder because it was a generational curse that was put down perpetually. Nay, even while Adam was alive, it came to pass that the posterity of Cain became exceedingly wicked, every one successively dying one after the other, more wicked than the former. And that's how genetics work. That these tendencies, these autosomal dominant tendencies, are becoming passed down and concentrated and more specific so that they express this kind of way of thinking and these kind of activities. He goes on to say that they were intolerable in war, vehement in robberies, and if anyone were slow to murder people, yet was he bold in his profligate behavior, in acting unjustly, and doing injury for gain. In other words, Tubal-Cain was one of the worst warmongers, robbers, and murderers that existed. Now, I refer to this group as the seed of the serpent. Many of my friends and Christian brothers and sisters, they struggle with this concept. This is not something that's been taught in most Sunday schools or in church, but the Bible reveals it right after the fall in the garden, that there's going to be the enmity or the battle between 2 seed lines, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. If you look that word up in the Hebrew, it's Zerah. Zerah is the word for seed, and it means offspring, sperm, semen, creating future posterities and generations of people. And so you come to the point of realizing that there is a seed of the woman and there is a seed of the serpent. The seed of the woman is prophesied to lead to the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And he's gonna come through all of the patriarchs, going all the way down from Seth and down through Methuselah and Enoch, all the way down to Noah. And then that line is going to be passed through Noah's son Shem. And Shem is going to be passed down through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob is going to become the father of Israel and the 12 tribes. And one of those tribes are going to be Judah. And that's going to lead down through to David and eventually down to Jesus Christ. Now, the Bible doesn't chronologue the seed of the serpent the same way it does the seed of the woman. But we're given lots of information and lots of clues about the seed of the serpent. And it becomes apparent when you study both the Old and New Testament scripture that it's a unanimous decision. Cain was of the wicked one. That's what the Bible says. He was of the wicked one. And there are many other verses to corroborate that notion. And so Cain's line seems to be this wicked seed line. And we have to remind ourselves that Cain was the very first murderer in human history. He murdered his brother out of jealousy and envy because his brother was righteous and because Cain was unrighteous. Now, Genesis 4 reveals that Cain was cursed by God, and he was exiled out of the garden into the land of Nod, which is east of the garden, in the land of the wanderers and the fugitives. And it also makes it clear that he would not be able to bear fruit in his life. Therefore, he would have to become a mighty hunter and a predator. And this is where he would begin to murder and steal from humanity in order to get ahead. And that would be true of all of his posterity. This was a generational curse that was passed down perpetually through his posterity. And you say, well, why would God do that? Because the prophecy of the proto-evangelium has to come true. There has to be the good side, there has to be the bad side. And this even includes going all the way down to the ones who crucified Christ. We know that the crucifixion was planned from the beginning of the foundation of the earth. But there had to be a group of people that were going to be the ones to do the crucifixion. That would be the evil, wicked Pharisees and Sadducees, who I believe are part of this seed line. It makes it clear in the New Testament that God says that he has the right to take the clay and make two different types of vessels, some for righteousness and some for evil and destruction. And that's what he's done. There's two seed lines. So what we see is this same Kenite seed line would eventually give rise to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. A lot of people reject this theory, but I want you to really put it into context. First of all, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were born, that whole concept really emerged out of the Babylonian captivity. Now think about that. Babylon. We just said above that the whole system is referred to as the Babylonian system. Even in the book of Revelations, it's the evil beast system is referred to as Mystery Babylon. So we see lots of references to Babylon. Well, after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, they took all of the Hebrews back to Babylon for 70 years. They were having children every 13 to 15 years in those days. That's 5 or 6 generations of Hebrews who were being blended and mixed with the Babylonians. When they were finally liberated, that last generation, all they ever knew was Babylon, because they were born in Babylon, their parents were born in Babylon, their grandparents were born in Babylon, and all the way up to their great-great-grandparents. 5 or 6 generations were born in Babylon. And so what you begin to see is that a little leaven ruins the whole batch. They began to take on these Babylonian ways. And what they did is they merged the Hebrew faith with the Babylonian ways, and this is what led up to this concept of Phariseeism, where these Pharisees and these Sadducees have become the ruling elite, and they're controlling everything. From this whole system, over centuries and centuries, emerged the religious leaders of Israel during Jesus' day. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, the lawyers, those of the law. And Jesus himself referred to them as wolves in sheep's clothing. That means that you're pretending to be a sheep, but you're really a wolf. You're an imposter. You know what you're doing. It's not an accident. He actually called them the children of the devil, and he accused them of being hypocrites and impostors. He even said, how are you going to keep yourselves from going to the eternal hell? Can you imagine the Son of God saying that to you? Now, coming from the seed of the serpent, they naturally opposed Christ. They knew who he was. They wanted to kill him. That's what the seed of the serpent's inherent goals and desires were. And also, his teachings were threatening their way of life. He was interfering with the power and control. It'd be analogous to the last lecture where I talked about JFK and that he came against the Zionists and they had him killed. These guys could not sit back and allow Jesus to disrupt all of their power and control. And by the way, they were the bankers of their day. They were the money changers who sat outside during the Passover when 500,000 Jews, according to Josephus, would make the great trek to Jerusalem. The Pharisees and the Sadducees had been spending many months before developing all of the animals and preparing to sell them for great monetary value, and they turned the entire Passover event into a financial, profitable system where they were taking advantage of the common people under the guise of religiosity. And so they could not allow this to happen. So as a consequence, they plotted to have Jesus murdered, thinking that this would give them the ultimate victory, and it would restore their power and their credibility. Little did they know that this was the plan from the beginning, and that the crucifixion would inadvertently fulfill the prophecies of the proto-evangelium, and that it would ultimately be Satan's undoing. Because Jesus is able to fulfill the proto-evangelium in that he's able to crush the serpent's head by overcoming sin and death on the cross. But meanwhile, Satan was able to work through the seed of the serpent and the Pharisees and the Sadducees by bruising the Messiah's heel through the horrible death and experience of the crucifixion. Notice that the proto-evangelium involved the crucifixion event. That's insinuating that the seed of the serpent would be the ones to accomplish that event. Therefore, it's logical to conclude that the religious leaders who were responsible for the crucifixion and whom Jesus publicly condemned had to be the seed of the serpent. Jesus himself referred to this group of men as serpents, you generation of vipers, and that can be translated as a bloodline or seed line of serpents, the seed of the serpent. So I want to take a look at an incident that we see in the Gospels where Jesus is coming into Jerusalem during the Passover event. I want to try and paint a picture for you. Josephus documents that as little as 500,000 and up to potentially 1 million Jews would make the trek across Israel every year and go up into Jerusalem for the Passover event. This was one of the biggest events of the year, and typically during this event, when they got to Jerusalem, they would purchase sacrificial animals for to slaughter for the sacrifice. And so, the Pharisees and the Sadducees understood this. They knew that these people were coming there to try and be absolved of their sin and to draw closer to God. And so They were the ones who were pretending to be these religious, zealous leaders on the outside, but on the inside, they were really just concerned with power and control and money, which is what a lot of religion is even into today's world. And so, months and months in advance, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are building up their business. They're in the business of selling doves and sheep and other things like that for money. They are the bankers of their era. And so, you can imagine how much money they stand to make off of 500,000 people. And when these people come to the temple, before they get a chance to worship God or go into the portion of the temple that they're allowed to go into, they have to do business with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the tax collectors and the scribes. And they've got to pay their due diligence to get in. And then a lot of times they also have to purchase animals for sacrifice so that they can use these animals to atone for their sins. So we look in Mark 11 here. Then Jesus went into the temple and he began to drive out those who bought and sold. That's the same thing. We're talking about the system here, this Babylonian system. That's also the terminology used in Revelations, right, for the mark of the beast. Whoever wants to buy and sell has to receive the mark. So this is who Jesus is concerned with, those who are buying and selling in the temple. And he overturned the table of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. That would be the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now the money changers are more like the tax collectors and so forth, but it's all connected. It's one big system. And when you look up the word money changers in the Strong's Concordance, it has two definitions. One, a money changer, one who exchanges money for an item, and the second word is banker. So these are the bankers of the day, and we see in this situation, this is the only time documented in the scripture where Jesus displays any type of violent behavior, in which in the other accounts it says he actually puts together a whip of cords and he goes around whipping and the people involved and throwing the tables on the ground and throwing the change everywhere and yelling at people. So, for the Son of God to respond like this should demonstrate the level of indignation he had towards this situation. Now we know it goes on to say that, verse 17, then he's taught, saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of thieves. Now in other Gospels, he says that you've made it a house of merchandise. So the den of thieves is, robbers, thieves. We've already connected that to Cain and his seed line. Even Josephus said that they were the worst robbers on the planet. He also said that he was the one who started this concept of weights and measures, because prior to that, they took care of each other, they lived simplistically, and they probably bartered with each other. But then Cain introduced weights and measures, and his seed line continued to perpetuate the currency. Now fast forward a couple thousand years, and any rendition of this event that you see outside of the temple during the Passover, you'll see weights and measures. For example, this is one of my daughter's cartoons. This is the Passion of the Christ, the week of Christ coming into Jerusalem for his crucifixion. And you can see him right here. He's getting ready to flip over this table. What do you notice about it? it has a weight and a measure on it. That's how you make financial trades in those days. They didn't have any electronics or anything like that. The only way to know if it was the appropriate amount of grams of gold or silver or bronze or whatever was to weigh it out. Same thing down here, weights and measures. And so these Jews are arriving into Jerusalem. They're making their way up to the temple. They're having to purchase their way in and pay a cover charge. And some of them are trying to actually buy animals, doves and other animals, to atone for their sins. And so naturally the Pharisees they're making a lot of money. They're probably, like most vendors during big events like Mardi Gras and things like that, where hundreds of thousands of people are coming. The prices of everything have been inflated, and they're going to do everything they can to take advantage of the common person. That's why Jesus says you've made it a den of thieves. They're stealing from people, and they're pretending to do it under religiosity. And I bring this out now just to try and connect it to this seed of the serpent, because as we learned in previous slides, this concept of weight and measures goes back to Cain's day. Now fast forward, and we continue to see the same group of people who are the ones using the weights and measures. And to make it clear who Jesus is dealing with, verse 18, and the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him. See, he was rocking the boat, their boat. He was interfering with their financial situation. And if you've ever dealt with the mafia or any kind of big power structure, the one thing you don't do is get in the way of making a profit. They'll kill you if you do that. Now, I'd like to quickly show you some interesting symbolism from a movie that I recently watched called The Gray by Liam Neeson. And it's a movie about where he is a drifter and a vagabond, and he ends up on the outskirts of civilization, way up in the northern areas of Alaska. He's working for a petroleum company, killing wolves. And eventually, the wolves start picking him and his colleagues off, one by one. And there's a lot of spiritual innuendos in the movie, including predominantly this concept of atheism. And they promote that pretty hard. And but there's some interesting symbolism here that I think has a lot to do with the story of Cain. And I'm going to try and see if I can reveal that. So in Genesis 8, now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass that when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel, and he slew him. So he's a killer. Now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. So Cain becomes cursed. That's number 2. When you till the ground, it'll no longer yield its fruit, and a fugitive and a vagabond you'll be on the earth. A fugitive is a wanderer, and a vagabond is someone who runs in exile. So that's number 3. He's a fugitive and a vagabond. Number 4, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. That means that the Lord is no longer with Cain. And then lastly, he goes to dwell in the land of Nod, which is the land of the wanderers, not in Eden, but east of Eden. It seems to be on the outskirts of civilization, where he's been exiled into the wastelands and the lands of the fugitive. Now, keeping that all in context, let's look at the very opening scene of The Gray. First of all, it starts off very dark, very cold. There's no light and there's no warmth. Liam Neeson is walking down a pathway of snow, like a snowy road, and he's heading towards this kind of loud industrial refinery that's polluting the sky with smoke. And he's thinking to himself, and he's kind of speaking out loud, and this is what he says. This is the very first words that we hear in the movie. a job at the end of the world. That would kind of be analogous to being on the east of Eden in the land of Nod, the wanderers, where the wastelands are. Next slide. He's a salaried killer for a petroleum company. So he's admitting right here that he's a killer or a murderer. Well, we know that Cain was the first killer. He murdered his brother Abel. Then from there, as he's getting ready to head into this trailer where there's a bar, he says, I'm surrounded by my own. And in the next slide, he reveals who that is. Ex-cons, fugitives, and drifters. So this would obviously be analogous with Cain in that he's a wanderer, he's a vagabond, he's a fugitive. He's drifting around from place to place out in the wastelands. Then he says, but I know this is where I belong. In the next slide, because I move like I imagine the damned do, the cursed. Well, again, this is in line with Cain. Cain was damned. Cain had a curse put on him. And in the last slide, he says, referring to himself and the men in this bar, that they are all men unfit for mankind. And right when it says that, we have a quick flash of this trailer that's got the bar inside, and it shows the cross. Meaning that he's a man unfit for mankind. Kind of like Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. This man has moved out from the presence of Christ. That's why they show the cross when he says that he's unfit for mankind. From here, he goes into this bar here and he starts drinking, and he's contemplating suicide. After this, he's going to go outside and put a rifle in his mouth and contemplate suicide. Now, I'm not going to say any more to give away the movie. There's a lot of cursing and a lot of violence, so keep that in mind if you decide to watch it. But here's the point. Within the first 120 seconds of the movie, we see a portrayal here of a biblical concept. Now, it's subtle, but nonetheless, all of the different points are there. He's a fugitive, he's a drifter, he's at the end of the world, he's a killer, he's cursed, and he's unfit for mankind, and he's not walking with God. So, this would be representation of this Cain and this group of people who follow Cain. So if we just continue with this same line of thinking, in the past lecture we revealed that there is a group of international bankers who are a Zionist cabal. They make up all the secret societies of the Masonic Illuminati New World Order. They've been responsible for all of the Great Depressions, the Great Wars, the Holocaust, and they're the ones who are in control of the world's international banking system, including the Federal Reserve, which is a private company that's running our financial system. They're referred to as a cabal in reference to the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. It's based on witchcraft and sorcery and human sacrifice, etc. And this all predominantly derived from the Babylonian Talmud, which took place during the Babylonian captivity in the Old Testament. Now, in my opinion, this powerful group of men today display the exact same characteristics as their paternal grandfather Cain, in that they prey on the weak and they rob from humanity. Now, I believe this is due to the generational curse that was put on Cain and all of his descendancy, in that they're not able to bear their own fruit, so they have to rely on the labor of others by stealing. And in fact, this cabal today also have much in common
with the Pharisees of Jesus' day, in that they are also wolves in sheep's clothing. They're pretending to be something that they're not. They're pretending to be this religious institution of Zionism, when really it's more of a political ideology about power and money. Turns out that Zionism has been one of their primary vehicles for establishing their New World Order. And when you study it closely, you can see that it's rooted in this whole Babylonian system that I believe dates back as far as time will reveal. It dates back to the ancient mystery schools and mystery religions of ancient Babylon itself, as well as the Tower of Babel, which, if you recall, serves as a prototype and typology for a one world order. The Zionist movement has always been a political ideology that's masquerading as a religious ideology, and that makes them very analogous to the religious leaders of Jesus' time. Now, this doesn't let the Gentiles off the hook, because as we've demonstrated in previous lectures, many rich, wealthy Gentiles also serve the Babylonian system out of greed or fear. And so we've got men like 18th century banker Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who helped start the Bank of England, who made quotes like this: "If you allow me to control the issue in the nation's money, I care not who makes its laws." He also wrote a letter saying that the central banks give the national bank almost complete control of national finance, and that the few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. See, that's these Gentiles who have to worship and feed the system because they're either interested in its profits or they're dependent on its favors. He goes on to say that the great body of the people, mentally incapable of comprehending, will bear its burdens without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is contrary to their interests. That's exactly what's happened. JFK even went so far as to describe this Masonic cabal as a group of people who plan to enslave every man, woman, and child on the planet. And it turns out that this system has been outlined in a very controversial book called The Protocols of Zion. This book that we see over here in the top right is essentially the blueprint, if you will, for the New World Order. It discusses concepts like controlling all of the world's central banks, controlling the flow of money, controlling the different branches of government, monopolizing every aspect of the media, which includes radio, newspaper, television, the movie industry, as well as the internet and all of the civil rights organizations of the past century. They talk about how they will infiltrate and become the mayors, the judges, the top lawyers, even on and on and on. Essentially, they control the agenda of planet Earth, and they control the flow of information. And we know that information is power. So the only true way for them to achieve their ultimate goal of worldwide enslavement is to institute a one world currency and a biometric system to monitor everybody, and that's the mark of the beast. As we speak, they are solidifying the foundation for this one world beast system, referred to in the book of Revelations as Mystery Babylon. And the ultimate purpose of this is to present the platform so that their Messiah, the Antichrist, can reign over the planet. See, the seed of the woman has her Messiah, Jesus Christ, and the seed of the serpent have their Messiah, the Antichrist. And I can assure you, they are getting close.
Now, I've showed this slide before, and I just can't resist showing it again because I think it's something that we need to see and read multiple times. President JFK said in a speech made to Columbia University in 1963, 10 days before his assassination, quote, "The high office of the president has been used to foment a plot to destroy the American freedom, and before I leave office, I must inform the citizens of this plight." The word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we as a people inherently and historically oppose secret societies, secret oaths, and secret proceedings. He's talking about all of the Masonic rituals, the Bilderberger meetings, etc. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it. There is a plot in this country to enslave every man, woman, and child, and before I leave this high and noble office, I intend to expose the plot. Well, we know what happens when you expose the plot. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means, that means secrecy, for expanding its sphere of influence. That they will rely on infiltration instead of invasion. That means they do it behind the scenes. On subversion instead of elections. On intimidation instead of free choice. He makes the analogy that they're more like guerrillas by night than they are armies by day. They do it in secrecy. And then he makes the prophetic statement that one day after I'm long gone, you'll remember me saying these things, that we should have stopped the nuclear program of Israel, abolished the Federal Reserve, and kicked all the secret societies, occultists, usurpers, and Zionists out of our wonderful country. Why do you think it is that after alluding to all of these things, he referenced this group of people? Because they're all the same thing. And as I said before, in this speech, JFK had the strength and the nerve to call them out in front of the whole world. And as a response, they murdered him in cold blood in public display for the whole planet to see. And there was Masonic footprints all over that situation. This is a picture of Daley Plaza, which is a Masonic square where JFK was assassinated. Now I want to remind you, these are not my words. These are the words of the President of the United States, what we perceive to be the most powerful man on the planet at that time. And he decided that he was going to rock the boat, and so the powers that be were going to have to kill him. And that's exactly how it was with Jesus. The only difference is Jesus came for that reason, whereas JFK did not. Now, if you were to do just an internet image search on Zionism, you would see that there are thousands of Jews all across the planet who oppose Zionism. For example, these pictures in the top left, these are Orthodox Jews. Zionism is a state-organized terror. Over here, Zionism and Judaism are extreme opposites. Zionism does not represent world Jewry. Down on the bottom left, you have a Jewish man who's saying that Nazism and Zionism are the same thing. Over here on the bottom right, Zionism is the main cause of anti-Semitism throughout the world. These are not my quotes. These are coming from Jews around the world. This Jewish man here wrote a book called The Holocaust Violence. How did the Nazis massacre millions of Jews, gypsies, and the disabled? What was the secret agreement between Nazism and radical Zionism? Up here, did Hitler support Zionism? Former London mayor says yes. And then you have Orthodox Jew Rabbi Cohen, who says that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. That's what I've been saying for the last couple of lectures. But most people, particularly the Christians, do not understand this. That's why we see such a powerful form of Christian Zionism today. Perhaps this explains why we see things like the commemorative Nazi coin that has the swastika on one side and the seal of Solomon on the other, or the Star of David, that was designed in the 1930s before World War II. Because, as it says here, the importance is that the Nazi Zionist pact for Israel's establishment is difficult to overstate. According to a 1974 analysis in the Jewish frontier, between 33 and 39, over 60% of all the investment in Jewish Palestine came from Nazi Germany. The international banking cabal planned this, and they knew that the only way that the world would ever allow the rebirth of Israel is if the Jews came under the most violent persecution ever, almost to the point of extinction, and that out of the ashes of that, then humanity would do everything they could to preserve the Jews by reinstituting the nation of Israel. This would explain why we see that a huge proportion of Nazi SS soldiers were German Jews, and that you had men like half German Jew Wilberg, who was taking other men of less Jewish descent into the concentration camps. How can we possibly reconcile that? Here we see Orthodox Jew Chief Rabbi Sachs saying that anti-Zionism has become the new anti-Semitism. There's a great confusion between the two. And many other rabbis who oppose Zionism. And I think this sign sums it up the most. Torah Jewry mourns Zionist aggression. What does that mean? It means that there are Jews in this world who read the Torah, who subscribe to the Bible, and they do not respond to the Babylonian Talmud. They are not Babylonian Talmudic Zionist Jews. So this is a very busy slide, and I'm going to do my best to try and bring it all together. But now that we've established the who behind the New World Order, it's time to take a look at the how. And the how has everything to do with money. Since this bloodline are the ones who instituted the first financial system on the planet, it's logical that this will be the same mechanism they use to enslave humanity. As it turns out, the mark of the beast has to do with buying and selling. This is symbolically represented by the 666 talents of gold that King Solomon received from the world, including the king of Tyre, which Ezekiel 28 makes very clear was Satan. It's also symbolized by the six-pointed star, also known as the seal of Solomon, that's been used for human sacrifice since the beginning of time. And I've said in the past that the six-pointed star has 6 points, 6 triangles, and 6 sides, and that it's a mathematical and geometrical symbolic representation of 666. And that in reality, when you look at the symbol of the Freemasons, the secret society, their symbol is the same thing. It's just concealed. Isn't it ironic that you can make that same symbol on the dollar bill, and you can make that same symbol on the nation of Israel? And now that we've established that the world's going to be enslaved through this mark of the beast financial system, it's time to look at how they're going to do it. And the answer lies in the almighty dollar. It's blasphemous to even call it that because we're replacing the almighty God with almighty dollar. The Lord says in the scripture that you cannot serve two masters. And so that's what we've done. The dollar has been used by Satan to mesmerize and enchant the entire world. What do I mean by that? If you've been following my lectures, we've spent a great deal of time talking about witchcraft, sorcery. We've gone into the meaning of the symbolism, the as above, so below, that in the Kabbalah, they use these symbols to achieve spiritual and demonic power. They charge these objects with demonic power. They call that a talisman, and then every person who pursues and carries that charged talisman around with them becomes enslaved under the power of the spell. You may say, well, that sounds a little bit fanciful, but let's just keep in mind that When you go to the garden account and we look at the serpent in Hebrew is called the Nakash. One of the definitions of the serpent in the garden is said, one who makes a hissing sound. And the example it gives is someone who whispers in your ear a magic spell. That's where this thought of hissing comes from. That when Satan whispered into Eve's mind and into her ear, to not follow God, he was putting her under a spell. He was enchanting her. He was mesmerizing her. This word Nakash also means to practice divination, an enchanter, or a fortune teller. So he's a diviner. He's using magic and witchcraft to put a spell on Adam and Eve. And it's the same thing that he's done to humanity. He has spun a crafty web, and all of humanity is its prey. And the way he's done it is he's used the almighty dollar to do it. And I'll give you an example of that. The most powerful spell to put a hex on somebody is the hexagram, the six-pointed star inside of a circle. This is used by all witches. If you look at the all-seeing eye on a dollar and you put the upside-down triangle on it, we see a six-pointed star inside of a circle. All 5 points spell out an anagram, M-A-S-O-N, that means Mason. That is a fingerprint clue of who designed it. And we know from previous studies that FDR, Nicholas Roerich, and Henry Wallace, all who are 33rd and 32nd degree Freemasons, are the ones who designed that symbol. They put the all-seeing eye at the apex of the triangle. And at the bottom, we have New Order Secularum, which means New Order of the Ages. But the word secular means worldly, so it can also be translated as New Secular Order or New World Order. This is a secret talisman that has been put on the dollar bill, and this has been charged and forged in the blood of many. And so anybody who begins to pursue this in an unhealthy way is going to become under the influence of the spiritual and demonic power that it possesses. Down below, you can see the ancient symbol of the talisman of Saturn. This is those who worship Saturn, and they use this image to do it. What do you notice about it? It's a six-pointed star with a circle inside, and then it has the astrological zodiac sign of the bull, which represents Baal and Moloch, and it's also symbolic of the Exodus event where they worship the golden calf. In past lectures, I've demonstrated that through sacred geometry, which is what the mystical Kabbalah is all about, they use sacred geometric shapes, both the six-pointed star and the cube, in order to fulfill their magic rituals. Specifically, they've even claimed that the six-pointed star is in relationship to the planet Saturn, which is supposed to be the most powerful planetary body within our solar system, and that those who worship Saturn are able to do rituals to open up the, quote, eye of Saturn, which is the six-pointed hurricane that sits at the northern apex of Saturn. And so I realize that's very complicated, but that's just how sophisticated this Babylonian religion is. At the end of the day, the seed of the serpent and those in power have been using witchcraft against the whole planet and against the masses, and it's worked. Because the dollar is a charged talisman. And now that the entire planet has become enslaved and addicted to it, and that we cannot function without it through this Babylonian currency and system, the New World Order realized that now it's time to destroy it, and out of the ashes of this old currency will birth the new currency. It's kind of like what drug addicts do. They get people hooked on it so that they can control them through it. That's what Satan and that's what this Babylonian system has done to us. We're all now slaves to the system. Essentially, the dollar has been used as a Trojan horse. And this is symbolized by the mythological bird, the phoenix. We see images of that down here, the double-headed phoenix, which is a Masonic symbol. You can see the upside-down pyramid with the 33, which represents Freemasonry. You see the royal crown on top because it's the royal bloodlines that have been controlling humanity ever since. And the reason it has two heads on it is it represents the as above, so below, or the law of reversal principle that we've discussed in the past. And on top it says ordo ab chaos, order from chaos. First they introduce the chaos, and then they introduce the order. Out of the ashes of the old, birth the new. This can be demonstrated through 33rd degree Freemasons like Manly P. Hall, who wrote the book called The Secret Destiny of America in 1930s. Notice the seal on the front. This is also the same guy who wrote esoteric literature about the rise of the phoenix. It's not a coincidence that you can go all the way back to 1988 and look at one of the most famous currency magazines about the financial system called The Economist, and on the front you see a phoenix standing in flames, and it's dollar bills that are being burned. What are they trying to say through this symbolism? That at some point in the future they're going to destroy the dollar, and out of the ashes of the dollar will birth the phoenix. This is the rise of the phoenix. Notice it has the royal insignia on the front, representing the royal bloodlines. This is 1988, and they say, what does it say on the front of the cover? Get ready for a world currency. And if you look on the coin, you can't see it in this image, it says on there 2019. Back in 1988, they were predicting that by 2019, there would be the death of the dollar and rise of the world currency. Talk about predictive programming 30 years in advance. This is why we see the eagle on our dollar bill, which I've done lectures on to prove conclusively that the eagle is really the phoenix in hiding. That's why you see the eagle on the Roman denarii. That's why you see the eagle on almost every currency going back since the beginning of time. We are now finally entering the final stages of the last financial system before the institution of the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast, although it's a physical mark, it represents the last currency on earth under the reign of the Antichrist and the ability for a person to buy and sell. And it's quite possible that the ripple effect from the global shutdown of CV-19 may be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. For out of the ashes of the old come the new. As the globalists like to say, all we need is the right major crisis, and the world will be ready to receive the one world system. Now, if that all sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, then let's continue digging in deeper. There's been a lot of predictive programming in the media. In ancient Greek folklore, a phoenix was a long-lived purple bird that cyclically regenerates or is otherwise born again. It's associated with sun worship, which is what the pagans have been doing and the Babylonian system have been doing since the beginning of time. And notice that the phoenix obtains new life by arising from the ashes of its predecessor. The phoenix destroys itself through a show of flames and combustion. In other words, it builds itself up and then it burns itself to the ground, and out of the ashes of the old, birth the new. Notice that the phoenix is one of the world's oldest symbols, which dates back to at least 3000 BC, which is taking us back even before the flood possibly, but even to the times of Babylon. The double-headed phoenix is the best known emblem for modern Russia, where it was inherited from the royal house of Romanov, and in previous lectures I showed that it was used on all of the royal houses. It's also widely known, coincidentally, as the symbol of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and more specifically as the ensign of the Order of the Royal Secret. It appears to have first appeared in Mesopotamia and served as a form of currency. Outside of its esoteric and alchemical meaning, the double-headed eagle has been used on everything from ancient monuments, seals, national emblems, royal flags, and is the oldest royal crest in human history. This is why we're seeing the phoenix everywhere. This is a depiction of the phoenix. Notice the sun above with the rays of illumination. You have the large purple dragging-looking phoenix, which is rising out of the fire. It's going to kill itself in the fire and then birth a new version of itself. This explains why the economists would use this as a symbol for the one world currency, considering it goes all the way back 3,000 years and was used as a currency. This explains the symbolism, for example, in the 2012 Olympics, where we see the fire and the purple bird being birthed out of it. This is why last year in 2019, we see the symbolism in the rise of the dark phoenix. And notice that every hero has a dark side. I've already explained what a hero is. In ancient Greek mythology, the heroes were the demigods. They were hybrids. And what do you notice about this woman? She's half human, half hybrid. You can't make this symbolism up. All of these things cannot be a coincidence. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from some of the world leaders. George Bush, the war in Iraq is a rare opportunity to move toward a historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, a new world order can emerge. How about his father? What is at stake is more than one country. It's a big idea, a new world order, to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind based on shared principles and the rule of law. The illumination of 1,000 points of light. The winds of change are with us now. That is a very occult expression. In the occult world, the illumination of 1,000 points of light represent this here. That's the all-seeing eye who's giving out 1,000 points of light. That's the Illuminati. This is Lucifer, the light bearer, or Horus, the sun god, who is bringing the light to humanity. He goes on to say that out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order will be created. Notice the date of this speech. This was the first major public New World Order speech given by a president, and it was done on 9/11/1990, exactly 11 years to the date of the event 9/11. And there's a lot of symbolism in the 9/11 event. 11 is a power number in the occult and in numerology. And we see lots of 11s. For example, the first New World Order speech was given on 9/11/1990. There's the first 11. That was 11 years before the event of 9/11. That's the second 11. We know prior to this, they decided to use call 911 for an emergency. That's the third 9/11. The Twin Towers make an 11. They stand 2 ones, and the symbol of them is that they form an 11. And there are multiple other 11s when you really start looking at the events of that day. And so we begin to see that there's lots of symbolism. When you study the occult, when you study the Kabbalah, it's important that they use specific times, specific dates. They always foreshadow the events in advance. And it takes us back to this concept of order from chaos. Over here on the right, Adolf Hitler. National Socialism will use its own revolution for the establishing of a new world order. This is not an old idea. This is in the 1930s. Whatever happens, whatever the outcome, a new order is going to come into the world. It will be buttressed with police power. When peace comes this time, there's going to be a new order of social justice. How about here? We are not going to achieve a new world order without paying for it in blood as well as in words and money. Arthur Schlesinger, a German Jew from the Foreign Affairs, which is the magazine for the CFR. Notice their symbolism. Here's a Masonic coin where it shows the 6-pointed star here with a double-headed phoenix here, and then the rays of illumination. That's the 1,000 points of light that George Bush was referring to. And then what does it say? let there be light. So again, the fallen angels are the ones who introduced to the seed of the serpent, the Kenites, the precious metal system, the currency, the weapons, all of it. The seed of the serpent are the ones who instituted the first currency. They became the royal bloodlines and the secret societies throughout history, and they've been in control ever since. This is referred to as the Babylonian system. And there's a lot of symbolism to reveal this truth. I've already revealed a bunch of symbolism in the Phoenix, but let's take it a step further. In previous lectures, I revealed where the actual symbol on our dollar bill comes from. It comes from the Pillar of Hercules. And that started during the time when the Canaanites were spreading all across the Mediterranean, and they were putting large Masonic pillars of Hercules all across those continents, including the southern tip of Spain, where the Straits of Gibraltar are, which are also known as the Pillars of Hercules. And so when they started coming up with a currency system in southern Spain at that time, which it wasn't even Spain then, it was Iberia, they created their royal crown. It has the purple dragon on the front, or the lion. There's a discrepancy about what that is. I believe it's a purple phoenix or dragon. They put the Pillars of Hercules on their currency, and over time, those Pillars of Hercules began to evolve. Down below, we see King Charles V. These are the Pillars of Hercules with the thing tied around it, the wreath. And from there, we see that real Carlos III of Spain began to put the Pillars of Hercules on his ancient coins. And eventually, those two pillars turned into this symbol right here. Two straight lines with the wreath wrapped around it. And as the years gone on, they got lazier and lazier until one day they decided, let's just put two dashes to represent the pillar, and let's wrap it around with a wreath, which looked like an S. That's where the dollar symbol arises from. You can see it down here on the bottom left. This goes even back to the days of Greece. Notice here what it says in the Greek. They don't call it pillars in the Greek. They call it columnus, meaning columns, of Hercules. The columns of Hercules became the dollar symbol. And these are the secret societies who've been funding it ever since through the Masonic Pillars of Hercules. Now, let me remind you who Hercules was. He was a hybrid. He was a demigod. And if you've seen my lectures, then you know that that comes from Genesis 6. That is the fallen angels mating with human beings to hybridize the genome. That was one of the goals of the seed of the serpent, to help prevent the birth of the Messiah. This was to fulfill the proto-evangelium. If you recall from previous lectures, we looked at the etymology of Hercules, and it comes even from the Far East in India. It was called Hercules, and that word meant a race of ancient giant gods. So what you come to find is that almost all of the symbols on the dollar can be proven and vetted that they come from the seed of the serpent. When it says on that bill, first of all, it says that it's a Federal Reserve note. They're the ones who own it. That's why they call it the almighty dollar. And where it says in trust of God on the front of it, that's a different God. That is not the God of the Bible of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that's the God of this air, of this world, the prince of the power of air. And he has been plotting this for a long time. This symbol came about centuries and centuries and centuries before America was even founded. You say, well, how is that possible? Were all these people in collusion? No. This demonstrates the supernatural, sophisticated spirit of the world, that in each of these different cultures and civilizations, there was always a master puppeteer, a mastermind that was moving humanity along, bringing us to the point where we are today, so that he could ultimately enslave humanity into the Babylonian system of the dollar, which they're now going to destroy, so they can bring about the mark of the beast system. So now I'd like to start moving away from some of the symbolism and start looking at some of the different factors that have led to where we're at today. One of the big ones is called the petrodollar. The petrodollar is any US dollar that's been paid to oil exporting countries in exchange for oil. Since the dollar is the global world reserve currency, all international transactions have been priced in dollars. As a result, oil exporting nations must receive dollars to purchase oil. In other words, if any country on the planet wants to buy oil from the Middle East, they have to use dollars to purchase the oil. That's how our currency got disseminated across the whole planet. All these different nations were interested in getting as many dollars as they could. They wanted to become industrial nations, and in order to become an industrial nation, you require oil, and in order to get oil, you need dollars. And so all of these nations have been purchasing our debt by purchasing 20 and 30-year bonds and treasury notes, and then they convert those into dollars and use them to buy oil. Essentially, we get to live like pigs in the fat house, and then we export all of our debt to the rest of the world. The rest of the world are the ones who are killing themselves in sweatshops to make all of the stuff that we enjoy, and then in exchange they're able to get some of our currency, and then they're able to purchase oil with it. It's a pretty slick system if you're us, and a pretty crappy system if you're a third world country. So all the world's currencies are pegged to the dollar. When the dollar falls, it causes a domino effect to the planet. Kind of like it did in 2008 when we had the banking and housing failure. That was an American situation, but very quickly it turned into the global economic depression of 2008. Because when you knock down the top dog, it trickles down to the rest. Now this petrodollar system is tied to the history of the gold standard and the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, which established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency during that era. After World War II, the United States held most of the world's supply of gold. If you recall, from 1938 to 1942, over a 4-year period, all of the major manufacturing plants and companies in the United States got busy. All of the men and the women were all working to produce all of the military equipment that we would then ship over to Europe to help support the war. We weren't in the war, but we were making all this stuff for the war. It was a great time for our economy because everybody was working hard and working for a good cause. And in return, we were receiving European gold, and we filled up Fort Knox with their gold. And so after World War II, around the 1944-45 era, the United States held most of the world's supply of gold. And so in 1945, President Roosevelt met with Saudi King Abd al-Aziz, and they formalized an alliance with Saudi Arabia and all of the other OPEC nations, and the petrodollar was born. This alliance was so critical that it even survived the differences of opinion over the Arab-Israeli conflicts over the years to follow. The petrodollar system has basically elevated the US dollar to the world's reserve currency, and through this status, the US enjoys persistent trade deficits and is a global economic hegemony. That means we're the biggest bully on the block. The petrodollar system allows the US the power to put sanctions on other countries, put trade embargoes on other countries. When they don't do what our government wants, we have the ability to affect their economy. Many countries don't fight back because they're afraid that it would mean the collapse of their economy. For example, the US sanctioned Iran for refusing to halt its development of nuclear weapons. Similarly, it hit Russia with trade embargoes for invading Crimea and creating the crisis in Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying that those were good or bad things. I'm just saying I'm giving examples of how when the rest of the world doesn't play ball, we have the power to do these things on their economy, and it causes them to get into line with our government's desires. Well, as a result of all of this stuff, these countries have now signed a 5-year trade deal with each other that's worth over $20 billion, which includes the sale of Iran's oils for other currencies. In other words, the rest of the country is tired of the petrodollar. They're tired of America, and they're starting to find other ways to get oil without having to use the dollar. Within the last 5 years or so, Venezuela and Iran have signed oil contracts in their currencies instead of petrodollars. China has called for the replacement of the US dollar as a global currency with the yen. In 2019, at one point, Saudi Arabia threatened to abandon the petrodollar. There's been a significant threat to the petrodollar as other countries begin pricing oil in other currencies, and also as the world shifts from oil to renewable energy. As a result, the petrodollar is losing its role as the world dominant currency, and recently there's been a shift away from petrodollars to other currencies. That's going to have a big impact in the future on the dollar. And there's a lot of literature and a lot of different books that have been written on this concept. I find it ironic how George Bush was really the one to implement the war on terror and really begin the West versus the Middle East era where we were against Islam. And meanwhile, every other week it seems like he was meeting up with the king of Saudi Arabia. And all of these are all different photos of different times. You look at the suits that he's wearing with a blue tie, with a red tie. Here he doesn't have a tie. Every time you see George Bush with the king of Saudi Arabia, they're holding hands. Make no mistake, these guys are extremely close. And apparently the war on terror that George Bush waged against the war did not involve Saudi Arabia. So this takes us to the BRICS nations. BRICS is an acronym for the 5 major emerging national economies in the world. Brazil, which is a large portion of South America. Russia, which is a huge continent or country. India, which has billions of people. China, which has billions of people. And South Africa. The BRICS are all members of the G20 summit. That means they have a lot of power. In 2015, the 5 BRICS countries represented over 3 billion people. That's about 41% of the world population, almost half. And 4 out of the 5 members are in the top 10 of the world's population. So they have a lot of power. Here's the symbol for the BRICS up here. You can see the double-headed phoenix on Russia's flag. As of 2018, these 5 nations had a combined nominal GDP of $18 trillion and 23% of the gross world product, and a combined GDP of $40 trillion, which is 1/3 of the world's gross domestic product, and an estimated $4 trillion in combined foreign reserves. So make no mistake, they are a true player and a huge threat. They developed the New Development Bank, which previously was referred to as the BRICS Development Bank. It's a multilateral development bank operated by these 5 BRIC nations. The BRICS' primary focus of lending will be infrastructure projects, which have authorized lending up to $34 billion annually. South Africa will be the African headquarters of the bank, named the New Development Bank Africa Regional Central. The bank will have starting capital of $50 billion, with capital increased to $100 billion over time. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa will initiate contributions of $10 billion each to bring the total to $50 billion. At the 2015 BRICS Summit in Russia, ministers from the BRIC nations initiated consultations for a payment system that would be an alternative to the SWIFT system. That's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabov stated in an interview, "The finance ministers and the executives of the BRIC central banks are negotiating and setting up payment systems and moving on to settlements in national currencies." SWIFT or not, in any case, we're talking about a transnational, multilateral payment system that would provide greater independence from the dollar, of course, and would create a definite guarantee for the BRICS. What does all that language mean? It means that they've decided that they have enough people, they have enough power, they have enough money and enough of the GDP to start stepping around the United States and the Western powers.
Here's an interesting article entitled, "The BRICS Bank Signals the End of the American Financial Empire and U.S. Dollar Hegemony." The July 2014 BRICS Summit was a momentous event, more important than the World Cup that took place in Brazil.
The BRICS sealed the deal towards the creation of a BRICS Development Bank and a $100 billion reserve fund that promises to help developing nations avoid short-term liquidity pressures, promote further BRICS cooperation, strengthen the global financial safety net, and complement existing international arrangements. The establishment of the BRICS Bank marks the delayed shift of power from the West, from the US and Europe, to Asia and to emerging economies, confirming the shift in economic and financial weight. See this delayed shift of power? It's a slow process, but nonetheless, it's happening. The center of global economic and financial geography has been progressively shifting east for the past 3 decades, with the epicenter now lying east of Mumbai. China will have surpassed the US by 2017 as the world's largest economy, while India has already surpassed Japan to become the world's 3rd largest economy. The tectonic shift in economic fortunes and transformation of the global economy is already evident in changed patterns of production, trade, investment, and capital markets. Emerging markets already account for 48% of world trade, with Asia's share being 31%. So these emerging markets are doing half the world's trade, with Asia alone being 1/3. The Great Financial Crisis and accompanying Great Recession of the 2008 were the final nails in the coffin of the post-World War II Bretton Woods world order, signaling the end of the American-U.S. financial empire. The BRICS Development Bank and Contingency Fund are the forerunners of a new multi-currency world that breaks U.S. dollar hegemony and the domination of the Fed monetary policy geared to the exigencies of U.S. business cycles and economic crises. The U.S. will lose its exorbitant privilege as the world's reserve currency as the yen zone expands. A multipolar financial world with new international financial centers emerging in Mumbai and Shanghai will be a more stable world, less prone to financial crises or hostage to mal-regulated too-big-to-fail banks and financial institutions in the too-big-to-fail hubs of New York and London. In other words, they're pulling away from the West. There's a shift of power, and I'm sure that that's part of the plan. There's no way that the Americans and the dollar and the Federal Reserve and those in the know would ever allow this to happen. And so this is going to set things up quite nicely for a world war. They're never going to let these mal-regulated, too-big-to-fail banks become less financially dominant than they are now. And so, but the point of this article is just revealing the fact that we've been going through a metamorphosis for a long time. People don't see it happening because it's so slow. But it is this concept of incrementalism, where we're incrementally moving along this path. When you look at the history of this country, we went from a beautiful, amazing country whose dollar had tremendous purchasing value to now today in 2020, a lethargic country, doesn't produce much, the dollar's lost 96% of its purchasing power, the rest of the world no longer respects or cares about us, and they're beginning to move away from the petrodollar and forming other agreements to push us out of our current powerful situation. In essence, we were this, and as we've moved away from God of the Bible in the last 40 years, meanwhile, we're progressively becoming this. We're shifting from a first world powerful nation to a second tier country. And that's going to continue until the nation collapses and we actually witness the death of the United States. Let's not forget that China and Russia are communistic nations, and basically they're allies. In the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic and steady rise in the price of gold, with an average of just over 17% per year. This precious metal is becoming more desirable as an investment, especially in the wake of global economic problems. Gold has always been the hedge to a failing dollar. China and Russia have been actively increasing their gold reserves by buying many metric tons of gold bullion in record numbers, and currently they account for 23% of all purchasing in the world. China bought 245 tons in 2010 and doubled that to 490 tons in 2011, and they continue at a rapid pace. Today, they're doubling down on buying as much gold as they can. These are some of the advertisements on the internet. Here at Market Watch, why Russia and Chinese central banks keep buying gold. They know that this financial system is coming to an end. And they know at some point there's going to have to be a global reset where all of the world's central banks have to wipe the debt off the balance sheets and start over with a new currency. What's interesting is that the Treasury hasn't conducted an audit on Fort Knox since 1953. And in fact, there's a lot of suspicion that all of the gold that was in Fort Knox back in the 1940s has possibly disappeared. Here's an article right here. United States government lost 7 Fort Knox gold audit reports. Every year, the gold in Fort Knox is audited by checking the official joint seals that were placed on the vault. They don't actually go in and look at the gold, they just check the seals, which can be doctored, by the way, that were placed on all the vault compartments during the continuing audits of the U.S. owned gold from 1974 to 86, when allegedly 97% of the gold was inspected. However, a Freedom of Information Act request that's been submitted in order to obtain all audit reports could not be honored, and 7 reports are missing. And there are many other articles that describe people in the government who've been trying to audit Fort Knox for a while, and for some reason they can't seem to get it done. And you have to ask the question, why? Meanwhile, other countries want their gold back. The Bundesbank Bank has announced plans to repatriate some of Germany's gold reserves from abroad. At least half of the country's gold would be transferred to Frankfurt by 2020, according to their president, Jens Weidmann. Weidmann says 366 tons of gold worth $11 billion have been delivered to Frankfurt so far, and they are now about 1,400 tons, or 41% of our gold reserves. Germany's failed attempts to get its gold back from the United States opens questions of its sovereignty. In October last year, Germany's gold reserves stood to around 3,300 tons, worth $120 billion, which is the second largest in the world after the U.S. The Bundesbank Bank has been criticized at home for keeping a major part of Germany's gold reserves abroad. Critics are demanding the complete return of the gold to their country. They regard the gold as insurance if a crisis comes. How about when a crisis comes? And the immediate physical availability would be the decisive criterion. When trying to remove gold from New York in 2014, the bank met obstacles from United States authorities when officials tried to inspect the German gold kept in U.S. vaults. Isn't that interesting? I'm no conspiracy theorist, but the Bundesbank Bank should be able to audit the gold once a year like it does with reserves in Frankfurt, said Hans Olaf Henkel, a German member of the European Parliament. Some even doubt that the German gold is still physically there. Quote, "We're still missing published lists of gold bar numbers, even though the U.S. Federal Reserve publishes this list for their own gold," said Peter Boehringer, founder of the Repatriate Our Gold campaign. In other words, over the years, people have allowed Fort Knox and some of our vaults to protect the gold. And now when they want to audit it, or when they request some of it to be returned, they've run into obstacles where the United States Reserve will not allow them to audit or have their gold. That's very suspicious. Now let's move on to 9/11. We've talked about the petrodollar. We've talked about the BRICS nations. We've talked about the world's gold. The attack of the Twin Trade Centers represented a direct hit of the trade and commerce of the planet. This was equivalent to a precise blow to the heart of the American economy, which translates as a direct blow to the world economy. And we were told that the Taliban did it under the leadership of Osama bin Laden from Afghanistan. However, America's response was to start a war with Saddam Hussein of Iraq. These are two different groups of people. And they changed the narrative and said that it's because he allegedly had weapons of mass destruction. A lot of 9/11 truthers believe that the official story has been manufactured and that the real reason for 9/11 was multifactorial, but ultimately it began the era of the War on Terror to help control the Middle East and protect and preserve the petrodollar. Follow the money. Similar to President Reagan's war on drugs, the war on terror is a war that can never be won because it's a war against an ideology as opposed to a literal opponent, although they've now converted that ideology into an opponent, being the Muslim nations. Out of the vacuum of the Second Gulf War, then turned into the war in Afghanistan, as well as the creation of ISIS, the Benghazi scandal, and much, much more, all as a result of 9/11. When you look at some of the things that have happened since 9/11, not only was there horrible loss of life, but there was a huge economic loss. This began the era of the totalitarian police state and the formation of financially bloated government programs such as the Department of Homeland Security, which did not exist before 9/11, FEMA, the TSA, as well as many other laws that are directly in violation of the Constitution, such as the Patriot Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, both of which allow the United States government to start targeting United States citizens. It also started the era of the War on Terror, and in my personal opinion, it was the coming out party for the New World Order. And some of the symbolism I've discussed in the past is that you have these twin towers, which by the way are representations of the Pillars of Hercules. They represent that there are multiple sovereignties, that there are multiple systems, that there's duality here. And then out of the ashes of that, they birthed the One World Freedom Tower, meaning that event signified the next step into becoming a global one world system. And this is symbolized by the as above, so below symbolism that we see in all secret societies. Here's an article in March of 2013. The U.S. attacked Iraq because Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. 10 years ago, the U.S. launched its indiscriminate shock and awe attack on Baghdad. Much of the country opposed the war. By the way, most people don't know that Baghdad is where the nation of Babylon sits in the Bible, and also very close to where the Tower of Babel would have been built. Much of the country opposed the war. The so-called justifications for the war were full of holes and non sequiturs, and today we see the war as a calamity. Seymour Hersh asked, how could a small group of hardline conservatives around President Bush, including Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and a few neoconservatives, so quickly throw us off the cliff? As it turned out, Saddam had no weapons of mass destruction, and the case that Secretary of State Colin Powell made before the United Nations was based on falsehood and propaganda. While we can rightly condemn Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Condoleezza Rice and the Republicans and the neoconservatives of leading the U.S. into this tragic and immoral war on the basis of lies, there's no reason to be any more forgiving of the leading Democrats who supported this illegal and justifiable invasion, including Biden, Clinton, Kerry, and Harry Reid. With their support, the war could not have gone forward. So don't let them fool you. The Republican and the Democratic system are just two different sides to the same coin. The public evidence overwhelmingly validated that there was no weapons of mass destruction. It's reasonable to believe that the cabal of leaders supported the invasion knew this in advance. Why then did the U.S. decide to invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power? When in doubt, follow the money. Who would benefit most financially from this illegal invasion? A lot has been written about the oil companies who had their eye on Iraqi oil well before 9/11. Yet there are much larger financial stakeholders, the U.S. government and its top politicians in both parties. The centrality and value of the dollar as essential to the economic security of the U.S., hence, at least from the point of view of top politicians and the 1% essential to the security of the U.S. The value of the dollar requires that the dollar remains the currency most used in international transactions for oil and that it remain one of the world's dominant reserve currencies. Suddenly, this comfortable status quo was being threatened when Saddam Hussein was trying to sell oil for other currencies and not the US dollar. This would have weakened the value of the petrodollar and undermined the US hegemony. This is the unpublicized reason for the elimination of Saddam Hussein in the war in Iraq. So what is he saying? He's saying, and I understand why the government did it. Let's face it, for America to remain the world reserve currency, they have to protect their assets in the Middle East. But instead of just being honest and telling the people that, they made up a big cockamamie story about weapons of mass destruction, and they created the war on terror so that they could get the American public to get behind them to go over there and secure the oil and secure the petrodollar. During the era when Ron Paul was running for president, he stated, Saddam Hussein demanded euros for his oil. His arrogance was a threat to the dollar. His lack of any military might was never a threat. There was no public talk of removing Saddam Hussein because of his attack on the integrity of the dollar as a reserve currency by selling oil in euros. Many believe that this was the real reason for our obsession with Iraq. I doubt it was the only reason, but it may well have played a significant role in our motivation to wage war. A year after the war began, Sohan Sharma, Sue Tracy, and Surinder Kumar also claimed that the unprovoked shock and awe attack on Iraq was to serve several economic purposes, the first of which was to safeguard the U.S. economy by redenominating Iraqi oil in U.S. dollars instead of the euro, and to try and lock the world back into dollar oil trading so the U.S. would remain the dominant world power militarily and economically. That is the truth. If OPEC began being sold in euros, estimates were that the value of the dollar would fall between 20 and 40%, which would have put the U.S. economy into a tailspin. The price of fuel would have immediately shot up, as would the price of other imports. The dollar would no longer be the reserve currency of the world or the currency of international trade. As Ron Paul also pointed out, the health of our economy depends on the international centrality of the petrodollar. This is what supports not only the economy, but our military and our ability to fight foreign wars. In order to save the petrodollar and the American hegemony, the war in Iraq was justified through the war on terror via the 9/11 event and the supposed threat of weapons of mass destruction. The media, which we've already revealed who owns them, the international Zionist bankers own the media, and they portrayed Saddam Hussein as the ultimate evil and an imminent threat to our very survival. And as a response, the U.S. launched a war that would kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, kill over 4,000 United States troops, cost over $4 trillion, and create thousands of U.S. vets so wounded physically and psychologically that many are committing suicide, and escalate the hatred of the U.S. throughout the Muslim world. The result was that the U.S. did protect the fragile, almighty petrodollar from the evil Saddam Hussein. I'm not saying that these guys like Saddam Hussein are a bunch of angels, but the reality of it is that Saddam Hussein, the president of Iran, and even Gaddafi were all people who were trying to buck the system. They were trying to price out oil for something else other than American dollars. And in every one of those situations, we schemed up some lie to justify going into a war somewhere in the Middle East. in order to protect the dollar, the petrodollar.
Now, I want to read an interesting article titled "The Ripple Effect of 9/11 and the Causes of the 2008 Global Financial Crisis." And I want you to keep all of the information I read in here in context of the fact that we're now entering this era of the COVID-19 virus and that the Federal Reserve is going to have to take the same measures that it did back in 9/11. So, the Federal Reserve raised rates on subprime borrowers. Banks were hit so hard by the 2001 recession following 9/11 that it welcomed the new derivative products. In 2001, as a response to 9/11, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan lowered the Fed fund rate to 1.25%. That also lowered interest rates on adjustable rate mortgages. The payments were cheaper because their interest rates were based on short-term Treasury bill yields, which are based on the Fed fund rates. But that lowered banks' incomes, which are based on loan interest rates. Many homeowners who couldn't afford conventional mortgages were delighted to be approved for these interest-only loans. And as a result, the percentage of subprime mortgages more than doubled between 2001 and 2007. The creation of these mortgage-backed securities, as well as quantitative easing, helped end the 2001 recession, but it also created an asset bubble in real estate in 2005. The demand for mortgages drove up demand for housing, which home builders tried to meet. And with such cheap loans, many people bought homes as investments to sell as prices kept rising. Well, many of those with adjustable rate loans didn't realize that the rates would reset in 3 to 5 years. And so in 2004, the Fed started raising the rates. By the end of the year, it was up to 2.25%. By 2005, it was up to 4%. And by 2006, it was as high as 5.25%. That's the usury we've been talking about. Homeowners were hit with payments that they could not afford. These rates rose much faster than the past Fed fund rates did. And so in 2005, home builders finally caught up with the demand. And when supply outpaced demand, housing prices started to fall and new home prices fell 22%. Falling home prices meant that mortgage holders could not sell their homes for enough to cover the loan. The Fed's rate increase couldn't have come at a worse time for these new homeowners. They couldn't afford the rising mortgage payments, and the housing market bubble turned to a bust, and that created the banking crisis in 2007, which spread to Wall Street in 2008. Notice that it was the 9/11 event that was the spark that lit the fire, and then it was the Federal Reserve's attempts to control the economy that ultimately led to the collapse. And let me just say that anybody who believes the official story of 9/11 needs to have their head examined, because there have been plenty of people who have vetted that the story has been so manipulated. There's so many different grievances in what they've told us that it's unbelievable. I'll give you 3 quick examples. The first one is that on September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of the Defense Department, got on national television and said that somehow the Pentagon has misappropriated $2.3 trillion. That's with a T. This is before the national debt was even that high. And so we're talking about some big money. And he said that the very next day they were going to begin an internal investigation within the Pentagon to try and discern what happened to the $2.3 trillion. Well, as luck would have it, the following morning, a supposed aircraft landed in the Pentagon, which is a 5-sided building, and it just so happens that it hit the side that would be where all of the documentation and all the records for this internal audit would reside. And therefore, the internal investigation would not take place, and we've never heard another word about it since then. The $2.3 trillion has vanished. Keep in mind, there are hundreds of people who have given testimony that they saw a large missile fly into the Pentagon, and that there are no cameras that caught any of the aircraft. The Pentagon is one of the most guarded buildings on the entire planet, secondary to, I believe, the Louvre in Paris. It's got several hundred cameras. Not one camera actually caught an image of an airplane hitting that building. And in fact, there's footage from nearby gas stations and others that would demonstrate that some kind of projectile came in and blew it up from the inside out. And when you look at the wreckage around the building, it does not fit the typical wreckage consistent with an airplane crash. There's no fuselage, there's no wing marks within the buildings, there's no seats, there were no bodies. And most of the people who had a chance to give testimony who were inside the Pentagon actually said that it was more consistent with an explosion from inside out than it was something hitting the building. Okay? Secondly, on the evening of 9/11, we had the third tower fall. Not the two original Twin Towers, but we're talking about building number 7, which turns out was one of the headquarters of the CIA, as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, the SEC is responsible for doing internal investigations on insider trading, and they had multiple active cases exploring the possibility of indicting multiple high-level politicians. But instead of being able to follow up with all of that internal investigation, on 9/11, that entire building was destroyed. And so, once again, the paper trail for these things has conveniently vanished. I'll give you another incident. It's been well documented that someone put out an enormous amount of put options on United and American Airlines the week before 9/11, betting that the stock would crash. And of course, those were the two airlines used in that event. And so the following week, the stock of United and American Airlines did crash. And whoever put those put options out stood to make millions and millions of dollars. When an internal investigation was done on that, the only organization that they could connect to the put options was a company called AB Brown. And it turns out that one of the previous managers of the CIA were one of the previous executives of that company. And so as you begin doing these close studies, you'll see all kinds of discrepancies with the official story. Another example is the hundreds and hundreds of millions of tons of metric gold bullion that was in the basement of the Twin Towers. There's been multiple different renditions of what happened to all of the gold bullion. And so essentially you can follow the money, but it's bigger than that. See, the international cabal, they needed an excuse to start the war on terror. They needed an excuse to go into the Middle East and secure the oil and protect their interests of the petrodollar. They needed an excuse to begin these large bloated government programs like the Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, the Patriot Act, and the ability to start stripping away and eroding the Constitution. And so they needed to have the ultimate false flag, and 9/11 served as all of that and more.
So why is this important? Because we know that history repeats itself. As a result of 9/11, the Federal Reserve had to drop interest rates and begin quantitative easing. This would create a giant bubble in the world economy that led to the 2008 global economic depression. In the wake of the coronavirus, the Federal Reserve made an emergency announcement Sunday afternoon by announcing that it would cut interest rates down to zero for the first time since the 2008 crisis. The Fed had already slashed interest rates to zero, announced over a $2.2 trillion of liquidity support to money markets, and coordinated with central banks around the world to address a U.S. dollar shortage. The central bank said it will use its full range of tools to battle the economic impacts of the novel coronavirus. After 9/11, they did a $700 billion bailout. Now it's a $2.2 trillion bailout. And this is actually old news. This is 2-week-old news. As of recently, they're already putting together the fourth package, which is going to put more money into the economy. The Fed also resumed the crisis-era policy of large-scale asset purchases by committing to Treasury purchases of at least $500 billion and agency mortgage-backed securities of $200 billion over the coming months. Powell said the purchases have no monthly or weekly cap, and that the desk is going to go out and buy at a strong rate that we think will restore market function and liquidity as quickly as it can be restored. That language is open-ended, meaning that they can buy as much of the mortgage-backed securities as they want. To relieve pressures in the money markets, the Fed already announced 2 days ago that it would offer more than $1 trillion in temporary repurchase agreement operations out of its New York branch, and they're already talking about bailouts for the airline and auto industry. So what does that mean? Basically, we're talking about deja vu, but on a much higher level. They are going to create the biggest dollar asset bubble that we've ever seen in world history. If you think the ripple effect from 9/11 was something, that would be the equivalent of throwing a big pebble in the pond compared to the coronavirus. In 9/11, New York City was directly affected, the world was emotionally affected, but the entire United States continued to work diligently, and the entire planet continued to work diligently. In wakes of the coronavirus, however, there's been a complete global and American shutdown. And so this is much more like throwing a humongous boulder into the water, and the ripple effect is going to be exponentially higher than that of 9/11. Look, I've already explained in the last couple lectures how the dollar and the entire Federal Reserve American economy system is just a house of cards. That we've lost 96% of our purchasing power of the dollar even since 1913. And it's basically just been a sophisticated shell game where the Federal Reserve is just basically using treasuries and bonds and every other scheme that they can come up with to buy and string out our own debt. When you look at the national debt now of something like $24 trillion, if you go to the website which shows the interest on that, you can't even keep up with the clock. It's moving so fast. And now, in the wake of the coronavirus and all of the response of the Federal Reserve, we are going to create the largest black hole that you've ever seen in the planet. And as these memes say, there goes the neighborhood. It's going to be a domino effect. They're going to blow this bubble up so big that when it finally pops, all of the world central banks are going to begin declining in a tailspin. And as the G20 summits have said in the past recently, that we're going to have to start considering what we're going to do when the dollar collapses. And they're already predicting this global reset where all of the world's central banks, which are all in the red and are all broke, are going to have to somehow magically wipe the debt off of all of their balance sheets and come up with a brand new system. And that's going to be the electronic digital cashless one world system. As the big banking Zionists say, we're on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order. I think we've found the right major crisis. Don't forget, order from chaos is their official motto. We need to have the right chaos, and then we can create the order. The reality of it is that the American economy and the global economy is analogous to a terminally ill patient. 9/11 was equivalent to a major heart attack that we managed to survive, but it cost us. And with the national debt being what it is, student loans at a record $1 trillion in debt, and unfunded liabilities of $250 trillion, that's welfare, unemployment, food stamps, disability, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. With the addition of COVID-19 and its economic repercussions, it's going to be the final nail in the financial coffin. A lot of economic people say that the total debt of the United States and the petrodollar system is 1.5 quadrillion. It's time to wake up, folks. We are witnessing the death of this currency and of this financial system. And just like they said the Titanic was too big and it was unsinkable, people believe that the American economy is too big and unsinkable. But just like the Titanic, it's already hit the iceberg, it's already taking water, and pretty soon it's going to capsize. And don't think this was by accident. They know it. They're the ones who ran the Titanic into the iceberg, and they're the ones who are helping capsize it. The other side of this equation is that the globalists have always been eugenicists. They're depopulationists. They've always wanted to find a way to curb the population on the planet. And the fall out of the ashes of America will help bring about their new Atlantis. When you look at the different graphs that talk about the human population, in 1942, during the era of World War II, we hit 2 billion people. It took us thousands and thousands of years to make 2 billion people. And then from the 1940s until now, we've tripled it to 7.5 billion people. This is what it looks like on a graph. It's a vertical curve. And anybody who studies graphs knows that that is unsustainable. And they're already estimating in the next 20 years that it'll get up to 10 billion people. And so the globalists are determined to reduce that rate. They're not going to let it go like this and keep going. They're going to make it go like this. So let's just summarize. Now that we know the who, that is the 1% elite international bankers, and we know the why, that is that they are all part of the secret societies, this Masonic Babylonian religion, which is Luciferian in origin, and their ultimate goal is to set up the mark of the beast so that their Messiah can reign. And we've answered the what. What are they going to use? What's going to be the system that they use to get us there? And that is they're going to use money and the currency that they've been using ever since the beginning of humanity. Now it's time to answer the how. How exactly are they going to achieve this? And the answer lies in the technology. The reason why we haven't seen the mark of the beast system come about in the past is there wasn't the technology for it. But now finally we are upon the technological revolution. When you add AI and robotics and nanotechnology, when you look at Wi-Fi and the systems of 5G and what they describe as the Internet of Things, which is to come in the near future, where everything is hooked up to the internet, your refrigerator, your microwave, your watch, your glasses, your television, your cars, and eventually you one day. Eventually everybody's going to be their own hotspot because we're all going to be hooked up to the internet. They've already figured out the currency. They've been working with digital cryptocurrencies now for over 20 years and worked out all the bugs. They've already figured out a way to protect everybody's identity and to secure it through blockchain, which is a very sophisticated system. They've already got the small radio frequency indwelling device and all of the biometric systems in place to monitor the whole planet. They've been foreshadowing it for 30 years. It says 2019 will be the birth of the Phoenix. They haven't missed the mark by too far. But when they're done with all of the 5G technology that they're currently rolling out, which by the way has radiation levels that are 10 times higher than 4G and 100 times higher than 3G, and does absolutely devastating effects on the human body and the immune system, by the time they're done, it's just going to be one big collective global consciousness. It'll truly be a worldwide web. And who could possibly spin a web big enough to entrap the entire world? I'll give you a guess. Let's just take a look at some symbolism of blockchain. Notice that blockchain involves sacred geometry, as well as the as above, so below mentality of the Kabbalah. When you look at it and compare it over here to Metatron's cube, which is where the cult of the black cube comes from, it's where the six-pointed star comes from, what we see is that it is the perfect geometric mathematic representation of a 666. We've already looked at the Kabbalah in the past and looked at the different elements of fire, water, air, and earth, and how they use witchcraft and sorcery to achieve all these things. When you read down here, Enochian magic derives from the writings of Solomon and are based on the Kabbalah, including the Tree of Life and Metatron's cube. Metatron is the name of an angelic being described in the Babylonian Talmud. In sacred geometry, Metatron, the angel of life, oversees the flow of energy in a mystical cube known as Metatron's cube, which contains all of the geometric shapes in God's creation and represents the patterns that make up everything God has made. These duties tie in with Metatron's work overseeing the Tree of Life and the Kabbalah, where Metatron sends creative energy down from the top, the crown chakra of the tree, towards all parts of creation. Metatron's cube contains every shape that exists in the universe, and those shapes are the building blocks of all physical matter. They are known as the Platonic solids because the philosopher Plato linked them to the spirit world of heaven and the physical elements of earth. That's the as above, so below phenomenon. Those three-dimensional shapes appear throughout creation in everything from crystals to human DNA. In the past, we've studied the concepts of the black cube and the secret societies who use the sacred geometry of Kabbalah to control the planet. We've also looked at some of the New Age ideologies like Ashtar Command, who talk about giving everybody a six-pointed crystal diamond pendant during the ascension process, which helps them have a change in their DNA so that they can evolve to the higher spiritual levels. I find that to be very coincidental that the blockchain technology is in the shape of Metatron's cube. Notice down here with Bill Gates' ID 2020 referring to the future digital identity that involves blockchain and biometrics. We're already seeing opportunities to begin rolling it out. Here on the Forbes magazine, just several weeks ago, new coronavirus stimulus bill in Congress creates a U.S. digital dollar. Notice below, crypto and blockchain. This is a way to float relief funds to the victims of the coronavirus quickly and efficiently. This would allow the Federal Reserve banks to provide digital wallets to each citizen. It could also pave the way for the U.S. Central Bank to establish its own central bank digital currency for use globally once the outbreak has been contained. Daniel Gorfein, founding director of the Digital Dollar Project, said, "This crisis underscores the importance of upgrading our financial infrastructure by broadening the implementation of our central bank digital currency." He also added that if China wins the race to make this digital currency, that a digital yen will be much more accessible to people, which is why there's an urgency to develop a U.S. equivalent. Same way that they had the race to space, now all of the countries are racing using all the different technologies to see who can come up with the world digital currency the fastest. They went on to talk about how in wake of global pandemics, physical currency like paper bills and change is an easy way to transmit disease, and a digital currency makes sense, especially considering that today 93% of all transactions done in America are done electronically and only 7% are done with actual physical money. When you combine these concepts as well as the mandatory vaccines that will be coming soon, that will probably be blended with the RFID chips, and you put these different quotes in perspective, which is a video that I've seen with my own eyes where Bill Gates says that if we do a really great job on new vaccines and reproductive health, we can lower the world population by 10 or 15%. Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have always been eugenicists. They want to depopulate the planet. Put that in context with what Prince Philip said. If I were reincarnated, I wish to be returned to Earth as a killer virus to lower human population levels. This is what they're interested in doing. This is why they're introducing concepts like Agenda 21, the 2030 World Project, and now recently we're seeing the ID 2020 Digital Identity Alliance. Quote, we're at a unique moment where emerging technology makes it possible to provide individuals with control over their own digital identities. Everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not going to be long before they establish your trusted identity with blockchain. And as I demonstrated in the previous slide, they're going to use witchcraft and sorcery dating back to the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, and Metatron's Cube to implement that. And Metatron's Cube demonstrates all of the sacred geometric shapes that make up everything, including crystals and even the DNA structure.
Well, as usual, guys, the lecture is getting long. I think we just breached 2 hours, so it's time to wrap it up. This will be the final slide. Just know that on the next lecture, we're going to start looking at the specific technology and how the enemy is going to use it against us. And I'll just take this opportunity to read one final famous quote written by New World Order eugenicist Henry Kissinger in 1992 at the Bilderberg meeting. Today, Americans would be outraged if UN troops entered LA to restore order, but tomorrow they'll be grateful. This is especially true if they were told that there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated, that threatened our very existence. It is then that all peoples of the world will pledge with world leaders to deliver them from this evil. The one thing every man fears is the unknown. When presented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being granted to them by their world government. And as Rockefeller said, all we need is the right major global crisis to happen, and we can move forward with a new world order. And I believe